released in order for, you will always remember the memory, but you won't have the charge, the emotional charge, or the reaction to the trauma. So we call this somato-emotional release, and it's informed by Gestalt, humanitarian, and psychodynamic approaches. And as you're working with the body, you might find an area of the body which feels, there's so many words I could use for it, stuck. And in fact, I don't like using those words, but kind of a holding, rigidity. Sometimes it can feel kind of almost like it's puffed up, but it feels encapsulated. It's, if you can imagine, so, sorry to bring this up, but if you can imagine somebody getting shot, there's a bullet goes through them. There is an exit point, there's an entrance point for the bullet, the body goes through the body, the bullet goes through the body, and there's an exit point. Often with traumas that are very physical in nature, so for example a car accident or a fall skiing or something like that, the trauma goes through the body, but it doesn't exit the body. And it gets trapped in this encapsulated form. We call it an energy cyst. And it can become trapped in an area that is different to the actual area that experienced the trauma by the nature of it going through the body. So while we're working with the body, these energy cysts often are released as well. And that can involve a lot of energy being released in the person and a lot of freedom coming into their whole system and their being, because often they've been carrying it for decades. With somato-emotional release, we call it SER work. Our ethos in CranioSacral therapy is that, we don't fix people. We listen with our hands to the person, and the body shows us where to go. And we believe that Dr. John Upledger, who developed Upledger craniosacral therapy, he called it your inner physician or your inner wisdom. We might call it other things like your unconscious mind, but it's held in the body and it's connected with the body, and it knows every single thing that's ever happened to us, every single thing that's happened to our family, our ancestors, the collective unconscious. Likewise, it knows every single thing that we need in order to be well if we would just listen. So when we listen to the wisdom of the body, we get tremendous insights and guidance. It's not out there. It's not going to a guru, or yes, you go to a therapist to facilitate this, but it's not the therapist, because in SER work we're taught to totally rely on this inner wisdom. While we do the techniques, there are certain questions we'll ask, certain visualizations we'll use, and conversation we'll use to help the person to process what's going on for them and to integrate it, so that there's no longer a charge around it, there's no longer the emotionality, the trapped emotions that sometimes have been there, as I said, for decades. There's no longer that in the system. And we can also help with this conversation to bring resolution. And sometimes that happens in a session, sometimes it can happen over a few sessions. It just depends on what happens in the session. So we're guided by the client. It's not us doing something to the client. I like to say we're holding the client and we're supporting the client, and we're allowing the client's own inner resilience and resources to come through themselves. And in doing that, they get to experience their own wellness and the part of them that knows everything that they'll ever need, that's independent from having to get it from somebody else. And that's really why I love this work. Have any of you heard of the ACE study? Okay, so in 1995 and 1997 in the US, they did an adverse childhood experience study where they took a large number of people and they asked them lots of questions about their childhood and things and their health. And what they discovered is that if you've experienced one or more traumas in your childhood, the reality is you're more predisposed to developing a major illness or mental health issues later on in life, dependent on the number of traumas you've sustained. So none of us here in this room are without trauma. The very nature of living a human life on this planet. I mean, if you look at the last few years, we've all been traumatized anyway. But previous to that, all of us would have had at least one trauma. Some trauma, yes.
I was going to say, just the process of being born is traumatic.
Absolutely.
So into the...
Absolutely. They say it's harder to be born than to die. So yeah, and you'll find that during the work, sometimes people have memories of being in utero or the birth process or being an infant, and it'll come through the body. So yes, very true. Trauma can happen at any point.
Can I just say something there? I used to, till recently I worked in a young offenders prison, and 87% of those boys had more than 3 or 4 ACEs.
Yes, absolutely. And this is the reality. A lot of
I don't know, sorry, we didn't understand it. 3 or 4 what? 3 or 4 what?
So 87% of the boys in prison had more than 3 or 4 ACEs, adverse childhood experience.
Yes.
So, but different, different things, but because they log them all and didn't.
Yes, and this is, I'm glad you brought that up because it's a great book. I'll be handing out more information later, but there is a great book called The Body Keeps the Score. Yeah? Yeah. And he talks about all of that, how people in he was a psychiatrist, how people in psychiatric hospitals at the time and these institutions, they've all experienced more or a significant adverse childhood experience. And it's how I don't know if any of you have come across Dr. Gabor Mate. He speaks a lot about trauma, and his thing is that trauma, the effects of trauma aren't what's happened to you, it's how you deal with the trauma when it happens. So we adapt, we're very adaptive creatures, we're very resilient. We'll adapt around trauma. Often we'll survive through it, and afterwards we're living through reaction rather than a response. So we're not, our life can become interrupted or taken off in a different direction, or we may not live a full life. We may not be in a position to receive all the goodness that's there for us. We may sabotage things for ourselves, all because this trauma hasn't been processed or released. This is another area of the work I truly love, seeing how people are once they've released this, their lives open up. And often it's very subtle. It's not. People think, oh, this sounds very dramatic. I mean, sometimes it can be dramatic, but often it's very subtle and it's incremental. It happens over sessions. So during a session, people often, apart from falling asleep and snoring at times, people often experience things like, the things I get told a lot, oh my God, I've never felt this deep calmness, or everything feels so still, or I really feel peace. And sometimes people have this experience that they feel that they're more than their body, that there's more of them than just their body, that their body is contained in something else that's bigger than them, but is part of them. So my understanding of that is being connected to beingness, being connected to the greater whole, or I don't know what your belief systems are, but for me this is the juiciest part of the work, when people experience that, because they experience it as themselves. It's not something outside of them. It's an experience that's happening in their body. It's them. They experience their own beingness and their own connection with Source. Which leads me on to the breath of life. So that was in the title of the talk that I mentioned. So when people see the breath of life, they probably think, oh yes, it's all about breathing, it's all about respiration, it's all about oxygen. So the breath of life for us is the craniosacral rhythm. So one of the developers of osteopathic medicine, craniosacral therapy is a branch off of the osteopathic medicine tree, but one of the developers of osteopathic medicine discovered that there was this movement, first of all in skulls, but towards the latter part of his life in the late 1800s and early 1900s, he discovered that there is this rhythm that goes through the whole body. It's like the whole body gently and slowly expands and gently and slowly comes in. And that is called primary respiration, which is the breath of life. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that through the craniosacral fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid. So your central nervous system is your spinal cord, your brain. And this is bathed by this fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid. Your brain produces it. You've got 4 fluid-filled sacs in your brain. They're called ventricles. You've got 2 lateral ones, one in the centre of those and one underneath. And these produce and reabsorb the cerebrospinal fluid that bathes your spinal cord and your brain and creates this rhythm simply because it's produced and it's reabsorbed. So cerebrospinal fluid is completely clear, it's completely colourless, it's very bright, and it's 90% water. Can you believe that? 90% water. And what it does is it keeps your brain buoyant, because the brain is quite heavy, keeps it buoyant, and it surrounds the brain and the spinal cord, like I mentioned, so it cushions the brain and the spinal cord from any kind of violent impacts or protects us from concussion. It also cleanses the brain, it removes waste from the brain, and it also carries things like hormones, neuropeptides, glucose, and something else. Sorry, this is where I go a bit blank. It brings all of these through the blood-brain barrier into the brain itself, so it informs the brain. Now, if you think about the brain, so if you were to draw a line in between your eyes at the top of the bridge of your nose, and another line here at the top of your ears, where those lines intersect in the centre is where your third ventricle, this third fluid-filled sac, is in the brain. And the front of that is the pituitary gland, which is the master gland that manages all the hormones. And behind it is the pineal gland. Have you heard about the pineal gland? I'm sure some of you have. It's very important. So the pituitary manages all of these hormones, which are, also released a little into the cerebrospinal fluid. But the pineal gland produces melatonin and DMT. So melatonin happens when we're in a darkened room and we're sleeping. It helps with our circadian rhythms, it helps to keep us online, so to speak, and it helps with appetite and all of that. The DMT is known, have any of you heard of DMT? Yeah, spirit molecule. So DMT is also known as the spirit molecule. And what this molecule does is it allows us to have mystical visionary experiences. It allows us to dream. It has near-death experiences, if you've heard of near-death experiences. And we produce this in our body. We don't need to take any hallucinogenic drugs or anything. It's already there to have these mystical experiences and these other states of consciousness. And this is released into our cerebrospinal fluid, which surrounds our brain and our spinal cord. Some researchers claim that cerebrospinal fluid distributes light into the body. And the other thing about cerebrospinal fluid is that it's part of our line of attack. So it's wouldn't say it's part of our lymphatic system, but it helps to defend us against viruses. That's why people, if they have a lumbar puncture, it's to detect if there is a virus in their system. So the cerebrospinal fluid does all of this for us. And I mean, up to this point, how many of you would have known about cerebrospinal fluid or heard about it? Yeah, some of you would and some of you wouldn't. So it's kind of one of these.
Can I ask a question? When you said the DMT molecule, where did you say that was produced from? I know you said it was absorbed and
The
transferred
pineal.
from the pineal.
So
And has it got a proper
if you
name,
think,
DMT?
if you remember me doing this,
Yes.
where these lines intersect, I'm drawing a line between here and here, but when they intersect in the centre of your skull, that's the third ventricle. At the front of that is the pituitary, at the back of that is the pineal. And the pineals, they both secrete things. The pineal secretes the DMT.
And what's its proper name, the DMT?
Oh, please don't.
Oh, sorry. It's fine.
It's some sort of, does anyone know the full name? You probably do.
Well, I'm trying to think of, I don't know if it's something like dimethyl something.
Yeah, it's a very, it's a chemical name.
I mean, they often use that in a lot of plants like ayahuasca.
Yes,
Produces
yes.
it in high amounts.
And
That's why people go for those
Yeah.
experiences.
Yeah,
But like you say, if you can produce it yourself, you
okay.
don't need to do those things. So.
Yeah.
And I've always felt that in terms of drugs and things that I think I'd rather see if I can help my own mind get to that state without taking anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are various ways to do that. I mean,
Well, yeah.
you know, meditation.
And breathing.
Breathing and dance is a great way of doing it. It happens naturally during dance, depending on how much dance you do. Sound bath, yes. Anything else?
I found that some of the effects actually, if you are very physically tired but mentally very alert, and it's a funny state to achieve, but if you can achieve it, then you open yourself up to those experiences very quickly.
That makes total sense, because if you think of, I don't know if any of you are interested in Native American culture, the sun dance and things like that, where they dance excessively and then they go into these altered states.
Yeah, it's also like the Subud and the Latihan type of things, where they do the spinning
Yes,
and things like
yes,
that. Yeah.
yes, all of that. So we can create it. And this is the whole thing, like our bodies actually just need a gentle nudge in the right direction. That's. I mean, sometimes, yeah, we may need medication and medical intervention. I'm not knocking that, obviously that has a big place, but our bodies often just need a little gentle nudge in the right direction, because wholeness, health, healing, it's all inside. It's an inside job. Our connection to a higher source, a higher power, divine, whatever you'd like to call it, or even if you don't believe in that, if you believe in nature, all of it is inside us, just to access it. At the base of the spine, you've got the sacrum, that triangular bone in between your hips. And have any of you heard of Kundalini energy? Yeah. So Kundalini energy is divine feminine energy, and at a certain point, it can rise up through the spine, activating all the chakras and out the crown chakra, if you know about chakras. And so, what does it go through in order to do that? But the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cerebrospinal fluid carries the Kundalini energy as well. As we age, production of the cerebrospinal fluid slows down. But there are things you can do to help that, and I'm going to explain that now. If it slows down, so if the production and the absorption of cerebrospinal fluid slows down, you can imagine that the brain isn't being cleansed. So amyloid plaques can start to form. This cleansing of the brain is very important. Have any of you heard of the lymphatic system? Yeah. So it's only in the last few years they've discovered that the brain has its own lymphatic system, which is called the glymphatic system. The G stands for glial cells. So glial cells are, you've all heard of neurons, have you, in the brain? Neurons that fire together, wire together, fire together. So for every neuron in the brain, you've got 6 glial cells, and the glial cells actually support and resource the neurons. The neurons wouldn't be able to do anything without these glial cells. So the G in glymphatic means the glial cells are involved, but the cerebrospinal fluid is very important to bathe the brain. So, something you can do at home to actually work with your own cerebrospinal fluid. I mean, great, you could all come to me, that's wonderful, but you don't need to, because you can do something at home to help yourselves. And there's something called, we call it a still point inducer, which is this unusual device here. You can buy one. They're, unfortunately, since Brexit, the price has rocketed up to £30. You can buy it here from the school, the Uplater School, and I have the information about that here. It's about £30 now. But you can also make your own device with 2 tennis balls and a cotton sock. So you put 2 tennis balls into a cotton sock and you put them in another sock and you tie a knot so that they're held side by side. And if all of you feel the back of your head, you'll feel this little ridge at the back of your head. So this bone here at the back of your head is your occiput, and this little ridge is called your occipital ridge. What you do is you lie down with this device just a tiny, tiny smidgen underneath this occipital ridge, like this. Can you all see it? So you lie down flat with it like that. And what that does is, it's very gentle, it's extremely relaxing, but it applies a very gentle pressure into your ventricular system, those fluid-filled sacs, and it slows the rhythm away down. Now, this actually happens during treatment itself. When you're having a treatment, the therapist can use their hands to induce this, but also the body naturally goes in and out of this still point throughout the session. Some sessions, people are in a still point for the whole session. So the production and reabsorption of the cerebrospinal fluid doesn't completely stop, but it slows away down. And what you experience when this